Thank you.
So nice to see you here.
Good to be back. Thanks for having me.
You are most welcome. You have written a terrific and very comprehensive book, really in the...
Is that code word for long?
No, it's long in a good way.
Okay.
Like the theorists of international relations of the past, the Henry Kissingers and others who've written a comprehensive review and guide on strategy in the modern world at their time. I consider this in that lineup of major works. So,
Well, thank you. To be in the same sentence with Henry Kissinger, that's very kind of you. So thank you.
No, thank you. I'd like to start off,
I heard that.
before we dive into the book, I'd like to start with a few questions about you.
Okay.
You are very visible as a scholar, a leader, a policymaker on the network news shows and so on. I'm not sure people know a lot about you and your background. So you grew up in Montana,
Yep. Good to see you here.
Glasgow, Montana.
That's where I was born, yeah.
And Bozeman.
That's where I graduated from high school, yep.
And your dad was a musician and a music director, and your mom, I believe, worked for the university.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit more about that, about your growing up in Montana, and then how did you get into this field of Russian and Soviet studies, international relations?
Well, that's a great place to start, and they're connected, actually. I was born in Glasgow, spent most of my years, somebody said they're from Montana. I spent most of my time in Montana, in Butte, Montana, actually, and moved between my sophomore and junior years to Bozeman. In Butte's a pretty rough town. Anybody been there? It's a mining town. Scholarship is not the top of the list of what we do in Butte. I was an aspiring athlete, not a very good athlete, but that's what you did in Butte. I was a good student, but it was kind of easy to be a good student in Butte. I did not read much. I was not that interested in the world. And we moved, I started my junior year at Bozeman Senior High. The reason we moved, you talked about my dad. My dad was a band director and then quit and went on the road for 30 years trying to make a living. That's the way I phrase it, trying to make a living and sometimes making a living as a musician. It's not easy to make a living as a musician in Montana. But he had a steady gig in Bozeman, and he thought at the Ramada Inn, and they were the house band at the Ramada Inn. We had 5 kids, not a lot of money, and so he thought if we moved to Bozeman, where there's this great university, Montana State, that their parental contribution could be to provide us a place to live. So we moved my junior year, and it's not easy to move in high school, by the way. I moved my oldest son from Moscow to Palo Alto. That's easier from Moscow to Palo Alto. But just in general, it's hard to move in high school. But and by the way, that steady job lasted till December, and he never played in Bozeman again. But that changed my life because I was trying to take the easiest English class I could take because I was focused on my running at the time. And my new neighbor said, take debate class. Do not take Shakespeare, because that's the easiest A. So I took debate class, and then I joined the debate team. And that year, the topic was how to improve U.S. trade policy. And my partner and I ran a case, you have cases in policy debate, about expanding trade to the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And that's when I started to get interested in Russia. And that totally changed my life. Adam Roberts, my teacher then, and the coach, that was a tremendous moment in my life. By the way, my high school debate partner was a guy named Steve Daines, Senator Steve Daines, for those of you who don't follow Montana politics. He's a very conservative guy. He was the first senator to endorse President Trump the second time around. One was in charge of the Senate re-election campaign campaign in the last election. And Steve and I still see each other from time to time. If the lights are off, we're going to agree on 80%. If the lights are on, that percentage goes down. But I say that because we're still, you can still talk to Republicans if you don't. Steve, I don't agree with him on some things, but we've been together ever since. So to speed up, I could go on about Montana. So as a 17-year-old kid, I flew to California for the first time in my life to go to Stanford University, my first trip to California. And I took first-year Russian, and then I also took Poli-Sci 35, How Nations Deal with Each Other. And those were big moments in my life and trajectory. And then the first time, I'll end on this, the first time I ever went overseas, you know, most people at Stanford, they go to Florence, that's where my wife went. They go to Oxford. I went to Leningrad, USSR, 1983. Again, I'd never been abroad. And just imagine that call to my mom in Montana, who thought that California was a communist place. She did not want me to go to school here. And then when I came back with long hair, and I was kind of radical back then, she had confirmed her hypothesis about our state. And then the next year, I said, Mom, I'm going to go to abroad. And remember, I can't see you out there, but I'm guessing there might be some people that remember the 80s. That's when Reagan was calling the Soviet Union the evil empire. That's where I went for my first trip abroad, my first study abroad. And more or less, I've been involved in international stuff and Russia ever since.
And what was it about Russia, the Soviet Union, the relationship with the U.S. that compelled your attention?
So, two things. One, President Reagan was elected right around the time I started at Stanford. And I was pretty afraid of the things he was saying, things you worked on in your career, by the way. I thought he was going to blow up the world. And I thought if we could just understand the Soviets, that we could decrease tensions. There was a lot of tension, 1981, 82, 83, the pre-Gorbachev, and that was one motivation. And I thought I could, understanding people that would help. We're not always going to agree, but we can understand them. And by the way, that's something I've been doing even when I was the ambassador. I still believed in that. There was a second piece, though, I want to say more honestly. I got to Stanford, and I was a pretty poor kid. My parental contribution to Stanford was $400, just to give you a sense of where I came from. And Stanford was a pretty rich place. I'd never seen so much wealth. I was pretty overwhelmed by it, and I was kind of angry about it. My dad worked 40 hours a week. I've met kids who their dads worked 40 hours a week, and they got paid a lot more money, and I had this kind of I was intrigued by communism, not communism, but left of center. That was off the record. That was off the record. But I'm going to finish this story because it ends in a very different space. So I wanted to see that, but I also had. I don't know if you remember Alex Dolan.
Oh, very well. Worked with him a lot.
I thought so. So Alex Dolan was a professor of mine at Stanford in the history department and political science. And all of his papers, he became my thesis advisor later, but he'd always write this phrase, which I still do as a professor. In the column, sometimes it would be many times, he would write, "How do you know?" How do you know? And over a couple of years at Stanford, I began asking myself, these professors would get up there and talk about the Soviet Union, and I began to wonder, how do they know? They'd never been there. So I questioned authority, right? So I wanted to see the place for myself. So it's both of those motivations. So the summer in Leningrad in 1983 was a fantastic time, by the way. My first time abroad, it wouldn't matter where you are. It was pretty exciting. White nights in Leningrad. Yeah, you had to stand in line for an hour and a half to buy an ice cream, but it was kind of pretty and nice, and it was fun, and lots of interesting other students were there. And I came back more critical of communism, but I was still in this more, contentious mode. But then I went back in the winter of 1985, and a bunch of things changed. I went to Moscow. I spoke better Russian, so I could get deeper into society. And I saw and witnessed and met, I met Jewish refuseniks, for instance, right? And I even helped them. That was one of my first acts of political activism. I met people that be musicians that couldn't perform. I saw decadence and corruption with the Communist Party, right? I remember going to a house one night of a kid whose dad was a member of the Politburo, and they had DoorDash. In 1985, nobody else in the country had DoorDash except kids of the Politburo. And then it was winter, and then my girlfriend, now wife, was living in Italy, and I was, I trying to make calls to her, and our stipend then was $50 a month. A call to Florence for 6 minutes was $72 for 6 minutes. $72 for 6 minutes. So I ended up working on the black market. Because I was really in love, folks, and it all worked out. We're still together. But working on the black market, I really saw the corruption. And just for a minute about it, because this is an ancient history, but my job, I had 2 jobs with these, fartsovщики is what they're called, these black marketeers. We rented, or we had this space in front of the Bolshoi Theater. And why did we have that space? Because we paid bribes to the KGB, right? Not me personally, but these Russians I worked with. And then my job was to meet Americans. We loved Americans and Italians most of all, because they were more entrepreneurial. The Americans always wanted to get a good deal with exchanging the rubles to dollars, and the Italians were fun. And they liked to, and we then had a safe place we would go, and we talk about peace, love, and understanding, and then we would do these transactions. And you've all read about getting jeans and stuff, but the best way to make money was currency exchanges. Mm-hmm. We would do the currency exchange, and then my job the next day would be to go to a bookstore that only foreigners could buy books in, and using dollars. And you might think I'm going there to buy Solzhenitsyn. No, I was going there to buy The Three Musketeers. Mm-hmm. That was our book, that was our best seller. And I would buy the books, and then we would go to the black market booksellers and sell the books there. And we would turn basically $3 into $6 from that transaction. And that's all corrupt, because that store is also run by the government, right? And they know they're going on. I'm walking out with 10 volumes of that Three Musketeers in Russian, right? And that's when I became a militant anti-communist, and I would say a militant Democrat. And the title of my book is Autocrats versus Democrats. That's kind of where I've been ever since. Mm-hmm.
2 tiny embellishments on your wonderful stories. Alex Dallin was at Columbia before he came to Stanford.
Of course he was, yeah.
Where I went to graduate school. And as he got older, he wanted a warmer clime, so he moved out to Stanford. And the phrase he left behind when people asked him why he was going, leaving Columbia to go to Stanford, better redwood than deadwood.
I've never heard that before.
I will
That's
always
great.
remember that phrase. With regard to fartsovщики and the black market,
You know that word, right?
I do.
Yes.
I started going to the Soviet Union, I think, in '77.
Right.
And the black market was all around. I actually already had my security clearance at that point. I was 23.
Hope you weren't working on the black
I was
market.
definitely not working on the
Okay.
black market. On one of my trips in the 80s, my brother insisted on coming, and he's not quite as careful. So he was out there doing currency deals and so on, and I was sort of going, no, please, don't tell me about this. But anyway, you went when young enough that you didn't get into trouble for doing that.
I eventually got arrested once.
Did you?
And that's when I stopped working on the black market. And by the way, our colleague Larry Diamond down at Stanford, I was just at a dinner with him, and he reminded me that his first and only visit to the Soviet Union was in 1990, because I was back as a student, a Fulbright scholar, 1990-91, and we were on the Arbat, and we did get arrested for doing something. And he reminded everybody, the one time I met with, the first time I met Mike in the Soviet Union, he got me arrested. Only for 3 or 4 hours, just so you know.
And also arrested for things that would normally be legal in any other country.
Right, called markets, yes,
Yeah,
market
exactly.
transactions.
Well, we could tell stories for a while, but let's go on to the book and the thesis of your book. This is your 9th book?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, and a number of edited works as well.
Yep. It's also my last book. So you better buy it. You don't have to read it, you just have to buy it.
Never say never. Tell us about your intent. What was your intent in writing this book, choosing the subject?
Well, it took me a long time. It took me many, many years to write this book. And partly because I have a teaching job, partly because I run an institution down at Stanford, Freeman Spogli Institute. So I didn't have all the time, every day I had to carve out time. But the book evolved over time. So when I first started working on it, it was in 2015. I was just dabbling. But back then, there was an argument in both academia and I would say even in the government. I served in the Obama administration, just had gotten out. And I'd always taught in my courses about post-communism and the political economy of post-communism. I'd always taught about China for decades. I've been there many, many times. But I'm not a China expert, right? I want to say that. I know a lot about Russia, America, and the Cold War. China's where I had to do a lot of work. And I spent the summer in 2015 at Peking University. We have a satellite campus there. And back then, there was this theory that countries that modernized economically could then become more politically liberal, right? And one of the earlier books I wrote in 1992 was how that did not happen in Eastern Europe. How after evolutionary change, then there was this break, right? 1989, 1991, and that was not the trajectory there. So I wanted to go and learn, could this be true in China? Because I was skeptical that a Marxist-Leninist Communist Party regime would evolve in an evolutionary way. Gorbachev tried to do that, it failed. I wrote another book about that, by the way, and I was skeptical of it, but I wanted to test the hypothesis. That was the first piece. By the time the book has come out, not many people, that's not an interesting hypothesis anymore. I actually still think it might be true, but we're going to measure it in decades, not years. But the second motivation was after President Trump won the first time, and his team wrote a new national security strategy, coordinated by H.R. McMaster, who's a colleague of ours at Hoover. And this was a pretty, you've been involved in writing these things. I was when I was in government. Most times nobody reads them and nobody thinks about them. This was a pretty big shift in that they labeled China and Russia as revisionist powers. And it got a lot of debate in Washington and academic circles. Are we in a new Cold War or not? By the way, let me put in parentheses, I'm not sure President Trump ever read that document. I'm pretty sure I know the answer to that, but that came off too flippantly. It's just that sometimes these documents get written, years into the administrations. So I'm not sure it had an impact on him personally, and we'll get to him, maybe him in his second term, how he thinks about China and Russia later. But there was a consensus that we're in a new Cold War and China's the enemy. And as a political scientist, I wanted to test that hypothesis. And if you ask me, are we in a new Cold War? First answer is yes, and second answer is no. And both those are true. There are some things that are similar, and there are some things that are different, both with the Russians and with the Chinese. And my second motivation was to take on what I thought was just too much groupthink and too much overestimating that the Chinese are just like the Soviets. And I disagree with that. And that's probably one of the more provocative things in the book. But then the third and last one, I wrote most of this book before our election, our last presidential election. In fact, I wrote all of it. I had a whole draft of the book before. And this book is written, just so you know, it's not written to be influential in 6 to 12 months. I hope, this will be around for decades, because I think we're in a debate about America's place in the world. And I think engagement is better than isolationism for advancing America's national interests. And I realize not everybody here is probably from the US, but that's my thinking. I think that multilateralism is better than unilateralism. So I like to have allies, and I think even participating in even things that seem arcane, like the United Nations, I think that's better than just going it alone in a cowboy-like way. And 3, I think that we are better off as a nation, and I think the world is better off, if we participate in supporting ideas of freedom, liberty, human rights, and democracy. And I go through that history in the book, versus just thinking that power is the only thing that matters and it shouldn't matter. It's on my mind today, given that the Saudi prince is here, Crown Prince is here. And that is a debate that is within the Democratic Party and within the Republican Party. It's not only between the parties, right? And that I teach about that, and I'm firmly on one side, but I think my side has lost a lot of the American people along the way. And that's why I wrote the book, and then I'm talking about it all over the country, but just so you know. My dad used to sing a song, "I've been everywhere, man." If you know that song, I feel like I've been everywhere, and I'm not done yet. But when Trump was reelected, that became even more important to me, because if these debates are kind of in the gray area, and we kind of think a little bit of this, a little bit of that, in terms of policy, elite debates, he's an extreme on all those. He's more isolationist, he's unilateralist, and he most certainly doesn't frame the world as autocrats versus Democrats. He frames the world as strong countries, strong leaders. He doesn't think about countries versus weak leaders. And some days I think he gets up and he divides the world between leaders that praise me and leaders that don't. And I just have a very different view of what I think is in the interests of my country. So in some ways, the end of the book, the prescriptive part of the book, is more important to me and more important now because of this era that we are now in.
So there's a lot to unpack here.
Yes.
One aspect of your career that we haven't really talked about is you've worked for the National Democratic Institute.
Yes.
And in your book, you talk about the institutions of promoting democracy. You're a very strong, small d Democrat, promoting human rights. In fact, I recall sitting in some meetings in Moscow with you where you were hassling the Russians about human rights issues.
Yeah, got me into a little trouble with Putin. I don't know if you remember that.
It was
tried to arrest me.
It was pre-Putin. I think it was.
That's right.
Some track 2 effort.
Okay.
But you talk about how we are dismantling the institutions that we have had to promote democracy abroad.
Yes.
There's obviously USIA, the Voice of America, and so on. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? Are we harming ourselves, weakening ourselves by doing this?
Yes. But I want to start with the diagnostics, because I want to acknowledge, as I do in the book, and I think it's for people like me that have had these views for a long time, that it hasn't been a great time for promoting democracy in the last decade or two. We're in a 2-decade democratic recession in the world. We're also in a democratic recession here in the United States. We'll get to that later. But the groups that promote democracy, the National Endowment for Democracy, International Republican Institute, National Democratic Institute, Freedom House, I won't go through them all. We haven't chucked up a lot of wins for a while. And in other books, but I do it here too, but I've written whole books about we got to rethink how we do this, right? So the critique that we heard from before, I share that critique, but the answer to the critique is not to shut everything down. The answer to the critique is to make these institutions work better and even invent some new ones. So what I think the president has done with his Doge friends, let's start with USAID. You can Google my name and USAID, and you'll see that I've written 24 articles about how to reform USAID. But I've never written an article saying we should shut it down, because you know what? The Chinese aren't shutting down their Belt and Road Initiative. The Russians aren't shutting down their economic assistance programs. And that's just what the president did overnight. I want to remind folks, when did that get created? That got created by John F. Kennedy in 1961. Not because he was a humanitarian, although maybe that was part of it, and they've done some fantastic work around the world to save lots of lives, millions of lives, but he did it because it was the height of the Cold War. We needed that organization to compete with the Soviets, especially in the developing world. Voice of America, another institution created during the Cold War. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. These are other institutions created to help spread independent news. The National Endowment for Democracy, just so I don't sound partisan here, that was created by Ronald Reagan. It was his idea in 1982 to create a foundation to help support democratic ideas around the world. And this administration is just shutting it all down. And I just think it's unilateral disarmament. We are not going to compete effectively with the Chinese especially, but also the Russians, if we don't have these instruments of soft power influence. I'm all for the hard power stuff that the president talks about. On that, I agree with the Trump administration, but the lessons from the Cold War in my book are we made mistakes. I have a whole chapter just so people, before you ask your questions about what about Vietnam, what about McCarthyism, rest assured I have a whole chapter on mistakes during the Cold War. But we did some smart things then, and I think this is a big, big mistake to shut them down.
What about the argument that we can't afford to do this, the deficit, other countries should step up?
Yes.
There is an argument that we spend too much on these efforts. How do you respond to that?
Well, I have them in the book, but I know everybody will be shocked that these just are fragments of percentages of money that we spend on foreign assistance. We think it's like 15%, it's less than 1%. So it's a very small part of what we do. But my other argument would be, what Secretary Mattis has said about diplomacy and soft power. By spending money, on little bits of money here to help us build alliances, to help us build, connective tissue between small d Democrats around the world, we avoid having to spend massive amounts of money going to war with the autocrats. And so I just think it's a preventive medicine, right? Rather than dealing with the problem later in the game. And the second thing I would say, because I'm a former diplomat, I only served for a little while, but I'm very proud of that time. We just gutted the State Department. Former students of mine just lost their jobs. People that used to work for me in Moscow just lost their jobs in this completely irrational way. If you're going to do a 10% cut, you should cut the weakest people on your team, right? They didn't even bother with that. They just wiped out all these people in this very irrational way. But even, just think about that soft power. Chinese, by the way, are expanding their diplomats all over the world. So who's going to negotiate your basing rights? I was in charge of Central Asia when I was at the White House, when I worked at the National Security Council. And Putin one day made an offer to Kyrgyzstan that if you close the American air base there, it's called the Manas Air Base, it's 2009, we're going to give you $2 billion. And so we, the diplomats, I flew there with Ambassador Burns, Bill Burns. He was the undersecretary at the time. I was working at the National Security Council. We're the ones that flew to Kyrgyzstan to try to negotiate keeping that base open. So this notion that it's just all hard power and this soft power stuff doesn't actually intertwine and work with the hard power, that's just not been my experience when I was in the government.
You noted that as we pull back, Russia and China are not.
Right.
And yet in the book, you talk about the mixed results of their promotion of their model and
Yes.
trying to burnish their images abroad. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, I do a lot of comparing and contrasting with the Cold War, right? So one of the things that are similar comparing the Cold War to now is that there is an ideological struggle between autocrats and Democrats, right? That's the title of my book. But the nature of the ideological competition is different, and it's even different when comparing China and Russia. So, in the old days when I was a kid at Stanford, I told you we're now all friends. You all know my history. You don't know, I met my wife at Stanford at the coffee house. We'll come back to that. But the old days, remember the ideological struggle was between states, right? The blue team, the red team, Poland, they're red, France, they're blue, Angola, they're red. That's the way it was divided. Now, we did have our communists here, and this is usually where I make a joke about Berkeley. I'm not going to do that as a Stanford guy. And there were liberals, Democrats in the Soviet Union. I met them as a kid, but they were pretty marginal in this debate. They were marginal to governing. What's different today with respect to Russia is the ideological struggle is not just between states, it's within states. And Putin and Putinism, that he invests a lot of money to propagate, he's a kind of illiberal populist nationalist. I could go into detail, but let's just keep it at that, right? He thinks the West is decadent and your liberal values. I've been in meetings with him where he goes on and on about all your decadent stuff that you're doing. You're destroying orthodox conservative values, and we don't want to be a part of that. And now he's investing to find ideological allies within Hungary, within Italy, within France, and within the United States of America. And we need to admit, and I write about it, he's been pretty successful. There are many Americans who ideologically are closer to Putin than they are to me, even though we have the same passport. I don't know if you know this podcast, InfoWars. They haven't invited me. Thank you, Commonwealth Club. I'm going everywhere, just so you know. I'm willing to talk to anybody about my book. They've never invited me. But you know who they do invite? They invite a guy named Sasha Dugin. Sasha Dugin is the chief ideologue for Vladimir Putin. And that's different than before. And that we've got to figure out a different way to deal with. With the Chinese, it's different. They're not focused on the developed world per se. They're more focused on the developing world. And there it's a very clear thing that they're offering, which is state-led economic development. And it is popular. Both of those are popular in those different spaces. I still end the book in a very optimistic way that I think, I agree with Churchill, horrible system of government, this democracy stuff, but way better than the alternatives. And if you look at polling data around the globe, it's not as robust as it was 20 years ago. I want to admit that. But most people around the world would rather elect their leaders than have the Communist Party or a colonel or a bunch of guys with beards claiming to speak for God, that's the theocrats in Iran, or a thug like Putin to choose them. And I think that's if we're united, which the president's not doing a good job about right now, but if the democratic countries of the world are united, I think we have much better ideas than the autocrats.
And you have some ideas about some improvements of existing institutions among like-minded, democratic-minded countries, maybe some new institutions. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, first let me start with the history, right? Because, there's this phrase in academia that we use all the time called the liberal international order. In fact, the liberal international order only worked for like a little bit. I'd say, it was when President H.W. Bush got the world together to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, that was kind of the peak of it working. And then we've had troubles, before and after. But after World War II, we didn't bring everybody in. We brought the free world together. And we created clubs to support both politically and economically the free world as we're competing with the communists, right? So we created institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, GATT, which later became the World Trade Organization, and then we had our clubs that kept us together, things like the G7, think of things like that, right? NATO, fantastic multilateral institutions of free states. They weren't all democratic at the beginning. Eventually they became that, and now we're struggling with a few laggards like Hungary. But they were multilateral organizations, free world versus the communist world. That was brilliant. that was a brilliant things that enhanced our security, enhanced our prosperity. What I worry about today is the current president doesn't like these groups, right? He makes fun of our allies. My Trump supporters, they say, Mike, this 51st state stuff with Canada is just a joke. Don't overreact. Well, I got a lot of Canadian friends, folks. They don't find that's not a funny joke to them. It's just not funny. Invading Greenland? I mean, seriously? That is not funny to our friends in Denmark. And we have no chance in this struggle between autocrats and Democrats if we're not united with our allies. So the first step is just preserve what we have. But then the second piece that's interesting to me is some of the global multilateral institutions are not working well, right? United Nations, it's not working like we had hoped when it was originally created. But if we exit, the president went up to the United Nations and just made fun of it and said, we don't really care about you. I don't really know why I'm here. That was the tenor of his remarks. Well, the Chinese aren't going to leave. They're going to be there. So even the things we created, they will have more influence in. And then the third thing that they, I think, have studied from us is they are busy creating their multilateral organizations where they're in the middle of it, right? BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRI, there's like 24 of them I go through in the book. When's the last time we've done that? We're not doing that. And so I won't go through some of my ideas I know are going to be radical for folks. But I think we've got to get in the business of creating clubs for the democracies to respond to what especially China is doing, but also Russia, bringing together clubs for autocracies.
In terms of influence, you talk about a promotion of authoritarianism in contrast to our promotion of democracy, which has been a cause for a long time. Who's doing a better job, China or Russia?
That's a great question. So first, I don't know. And second, I'm going to write an article about that. Generally in the book, I say this is a time of democratic recession, and one of the causes, not the only cause, we've done a lot of self-inflicting mistakes here at home. And in one of the chapters, I say my biggest worry about American security is not China or Russia; it's us and our polarization at home. I'll come back to that in a minute. But I think until Putin launched his horrific, barbaric, full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and that was an escalation of the war in 2014. Our president seems to forget that. He thinks there wasn't a war when he was president. There actually was a war in Ukraine the entire time he was president the first time around. I would have said Putin, because what I saw was he was winning these allies through his NGOs, through his Russia Today on our social media, through the Russian Orthodox Church, meeting with conservative churches in America. I remember when I was ambassador, when I first got one of these cables, 2012, I think it was, a group of evangelical leaders from churches in the southern part of our country were invited by the Russian Orthodox Church to talk about preservation of conservative values. That was wild to me that this was coming together. And I would have said that he was making inroads and we weren't really watching this. And that it was millions of Americans that liked Putin. Invading Ukraine has complicated that and slowed that down, but it hasn't gone to zero. It most certainly has not gone to zero either in Europe or the United States. The Chinese system is more subtle. They are not, and this is where I depart ways with some of my colleagues in government, both today and in the Biden administration. I do not believe that the Chinese are seeking to make the entire world communist. A lot of politicians say China is an existential threat. It's the greatest threat we've ever had in the history of the United States of America. I do not share that assessment. I looked at the data as a social scientist. Existential, that word took me a long time to learn as a kid at Stanford. And ontological, I still can't quite figure out that one. But existential means literally they want to wipe us off the face of the earth. That is just an overstatement. The Soviets actually did want to do that. They wanted world communism. That's not the Chinese project. And I think if we think it's the project, we're going to make some mistakes in terms of trying to contain like we did in the early part of the Cold War. But where they're better at it is preserving autocracy, providing their allies with incredible, technology to surveil people. That's something the Soviets did not have. With providing economic assistance to help autocrats around the world. And the Chinese model is a pretty amazing model. They've had growth for 4 decades. That's something they can sell to other countries around the world that want to have same growth rates. I think one of the paradoxes of that, again, that I go through in detail in the book, is that the Chinese model of economic development that was so fantastically successful was not successful because it was a one-party communist state. It was successful because they adopted some market principles from us. That's Deng Xiaoping, right? You had communism under Mao for 2 decades, same political system that was one of the most horrific, disastrous economies of the 20th century. That's not the variable that drove growth. It was Deng Xiaoping's reform then carried out for 3 other leaders, and Xi Jinping, I think, is actually undermining that now. And I think they've got some real troubles back at home. But that I think that's important for us to understand. It's not communism as a model that has led to this growth. It's been actually being more like us. And so what they're exporting now is kind of confusing. Are they exporting what they were doing 30 years ago, or are they exporting what I would say is a much more heavy-handed system under Xi Jinping that I do not think will be as successful economically, and of course politically, it's a full-blown dictatorship.
Another less dramatic term that's used for China today, less dramatic than an existential threat, is the pacing threat.
Yes.
Meaning military buildup on their part, including nuclear weapons,
Yep.
And types of systems and so on, does require responses from us to
Yes.
keep deterrence in place. Could you comment on that? Is China a pacing threat? Do we have to respond in certain
Yes.
ways?
So that's a phrase that came from the Biden administration. I agree with that assessment. And this is why, I told you the world is not black and white, and it's not bumper stickers, and this is complex, right? The word Goldilocks, my editor said, appears like a dozen times in my book, because I actually think Goldilocks solutions is the right solution. If we overcommit to that threat, then we're going to do a lot of stupid things like we did in the Cold War. We're going to think we have to contain the Chinese everywhere. That's what got us into Vietnam, folks. That's what got us into Angola. That's what drove McCarthyism. We don't need to replicate those mistakes to keep up with the pacing threat of China. And at the same time, we do, tragically but necessarily, have to do more in terms of military spending. We've fallen behind, especially on our shipbuilding. We're just not keeping up with the Chinese on that. We have to, in terms of the pacing threat, we have to revitalize our American economy. We're doing well, but some of the things that the president is messing with, I really worry about the model that was so successful in the Cold War, including research and development and attracting students from all over the world. Just yesterday, the data came out, we're down like 8%, and the White House is applauding that we have less international students here. I'm thinking, how can you think this is a success? That's exactly what made us such a great country. That's how we outpaced the Soviets during the Cold War. So that we have to keep pacing on that. And I quote Gina Raimondo in the book, we spend so much time talking about tripping the Chinese, right? And we have to do some of that. I agree with that. But we also just have to learn to run faster ourselves. So I agree with that. And then The other thing I would say, when I think about where are the biggest worries for me in terms of us getting dragged into a war with China or Russia, it's Lithuania or Estonia, and it's Taiwan. And I go into detail about how we have to enhance deterrence in both of those theaters as a way to prevent war, right? That's what deterrence is about. It's to prevent war. And with respect to the Chinese, I say two things in my book. One, we have to do more to prevent war over the island of Taiwan. One of the greatest achievements of the Cold War was the non-event of the war over Taiwan. And when I teach at Stanford, I spend a lot of time on non-events because nobody writes books about non-events, right? Nobody writes about the war that almost happened, the revolution that almost happened, the election that was almost won. Actually, some people do write books about that. Now I think about it. One of them blurred my book. If you buy it, you can flip it over. And I love her to death, Secretary Clinton. But you get my point, right? We got to focus, and this is a big problem in social science, and I would say in foreign policy too. We don't think about the non-events. The non-event of no war over Taiwan, fantastic achievement. We have to do that again. And that means more deterrence on our side, and then being much more precise in our language about not recognizing Taiwan as an independent country. We have some politicians that go to the island from time to time and say that. They're former people. I'm not going to name them now. And I'm not talking about Nancy Pelosi, by the way. That visit, I was in Taiwan the week after Speaker Pelosi came. That was different. She was much more careful with her language. But I just was in Taiwan 3 or 4 months ago, and I can tell you that they, including the party that's in charge today, which is considered more pro-independence, DPP, they understand that declaring independence, that's a trigger for war. And so we have to live with preserving this non-event, more deterrence, but also not triggering a war by declaring we recognize the independence of Taiwan.
Funny you should say that. One of the audience questions is China going to attack Taiwan by 2027?
Well, let me say a few things about that. First of all, I'm a political scientist by training. I've been teaching at Stanford for 30 years. And we are horrible at predicting the future, okay? We don't have a great track record. But I also worked in the government for 5 years, and without sharing any secrets, our intelligence community is also not very good at predicting the future. When I was there, we got the Green Revolution in Iran in 2009 wrong. We got the Arab Spring in 2011 wrong. We didn't predict that. We didn't predict the uprising in Russia in 2011. And we didn't get the revolution of dignity in Ukraine in 2014. So we're all in this together, and that it's really hard to predict. 2027, that's a date that people use. People have written books about it. I see that as a low probability event. I don't think that will happen. I just don't see it. I don't think they're ready. But I do think we can influence that number. We can influence that year. And I mentioned one part of it, but I want to mention another part of it. It's not just what we do in terms of enhancing our deterrence in the Pacific and encouraging our friends in Taiwan to do more as well. They do. And with that, I agree with President Trump, burden sharing. We got to do more of that. But it also is related to the theater in Europe. And sometimes I just feel like the Trump administration doesn't get how these are connected. If Putin wins in Ukraine, and we can talk about what that means it's more likely that Xi Jinping will invade Taiwan. Conversely, if Putin is stopped in Ukraine and it's considered a defeat for an autocrat, that will make it less likely that Xi Jinping will try to invade the island of Taiwan. And I make the arguments about how these are intertwined in my book, but if you don't believe me, go to Taiwan. And when you go to government offices in Taiwan, you're going to see a lot of Ukrainian flags because they understand this connection. And this is about being the leader of the free world. I think some people want to say we don't want to do that anymore. But I think if we help the Ukrainians win, and we're not doing enough, that will help us prevent war over Taiwan.
So let's talk about Ukraine a little bit more. Path ahead, preferred policy directions, in your view?
Well, so for those of you who don't know, I'm very engaged in things Ukrainian. I talk to Ukrainians every single day. At the institute I run, because I'm wrapping up, we were just talking, this is my 11th and last year as the director of FSI. We just had to do a lot of data about how many expansion and money we raised and all this. And we counted up, we've trained 250 Ukrainians at FSI since I've been there. And we hosted President Zelensky, by the way, in 2021. Let me tell you a personal story. One of those graduates from one of our training programs, I was in touch in the run-up to the second invasion, lobbying for us to do more with my colleagues in the Biden administration and do more and faster. I think we should have provided more weapons faster. I'll come back to that in a minute. But Svetlana's her name. Svetlana Zelishuk is her name. By the way, she just became the Ukrainian ambassador to Sweden like 2 months ago. Former member of parliament, and we're texting on the day of the invasion. And she's stuck in traffic with, this giant traffic jam to get out of Kiev because they thought Kiev was going to be taken. And she's with her baby, 6-month-old baby, trying to flee the city. And she said to me, Mike, you know the history of Ukraine. We will fight these folks. We will win. I have no doubt about that. I just don't know how long it's going to take. But she said, I can't believe we have to fight these bastards alone. And from that day on, I was like, just me as a professor at Stanford, we're not going to fight alone. So I'd say that because I'm not kind of neutral analyst on this. I know good versus evil in this fight. I know which country's an imperial dictatorship and which country's a fledgling democracy. I don't want to pretend to be neutral, and we shouldn't be neutral. But in talking to Ukrainians just recently, the battlefield is tough. They are under a lot of pressure. They're losing territory every day. Little bits, but they're incrementally losing territory. And Putin's just slaughtering all these young boys every single day. He doesn't care, just throwing them. They're just cannon fodder, right? By some accounts, 1.2 million casualties now in this war. You got to go way back to find casualties of that magnitude. I think it's actually World War II for the Soviets. But he doesn't care because he wants to he thinks we're going to lose interest, and eventually he'll be able to capture the 4 regions of Ukraine that he on paper annexed. That I don't think he's going to stop unless he's stopped, and that then gets us to us. And this is complex. So let me say a few things. So I applaud President Trump when he said on the campaign trail, and he said before, that I'm going to try to end this war. I congratulate him that he's said that. I even supported his engagement with the Russians, Vladimir Putin included. And this is a guy, just so everybody knows, who's killed 2 of my personal friends, and killed Russian friends, and killed countless relatives of friends of mine in Ukraine. But I still believe that if you're going to negotiate the end of the war, you got to engage with Putin and the Russians. Where the president has been wrong until recently, he's kind of changed his mind a little bit, but his theory of how to end the war, I just think was categorically wrong. His theory, and his special envoy Witkoff was a part of this, was just talk to Putin, send Witkoff to Moscow, and have him write down everything that Putin wanted, and then go to the Ukrainians and say, here's what you guys got to do to end the war. That's basically what they're doing. Now, I'm not a real estate guy. I don't know how it works, the art of the deal and all that. But I have negotiated with the Russians, and that doesn't work. that for Putin, you're signaling weakness. And so what did he do, which I said before and I predicted, and it's exactly what he did. He got the first 8 items, and so then he just asked for more. That's what he did. Appeasement, okay, I can get anything I want from these guys. And you know what the last ask was? And I know this from talking to the Ukrainians. His last ask was, can you tell Zelensky to withdraw his soldiers from their positions in Donbass, the parts of Donbass, eastern Ukraine, that they occupy right now? So Putin, after trying for 11 years, he's been trying to conquer Donbass since 2014. His soldiers couldn't do it, so he asked Trump to do it, and they actually asked Zelensky, would he withdraw? So that doesn't work. That doesn't work. And the one other thing, now I'm going on too long, but one other thing, I learned this from a guy named George Shultz. He was a mentor of mine down at Stanford. Wrote this brilliant book on diplomacy, but it was 1,200 pages long, so not enough people read it. Mine's really short compared to his. My first draft was actually 1,200 pages and 6,000 footnotes, but I've trimmed it down for you, so you don't be afraid. But George wrote about engaging with the Soviets and negotiating with them. You have to talk to them. The Reagan folks weren't doing that before he got there in 1982. But he said something very important in that book that for me was important when I was a diplomat. He said, make meetings about outcomes that are good for the American people, not for any other country, but that are good for you. He worked for you, right? And I think President Trump doesn't understand that. I think he thinks it's about him and not about advancing American interests. And then 2, George, I'm paraphrasing here. I think it's chapter 29, by the way. You can check me on that. He said, don't check your values at the door. And it's on my mind because of the meeting with MBS today. You got to deal with autocrats. They did. But Schultz always, you knew where he stood. And I think the president makes this mistake that if you're chummy with these folks, that they're going to do you favors. And I just don't see any evidence that works that way. So I think those are mistakes. But the good news is that I think he now sees that he's been played by Putin. He's sanctioned a couple of companies. I applaud him for that, Rosneft and Lukoil. And now I just wish he would do more to give the Ukrainians the weapons that they need to stop Putin's army on the battlefield. And let me say one thing that about this is very important to me. I applaud the fact that he allows our companies to sell weapons to our European allies, that gives them to Ukraine. That's great. But as an American, I'm embarrassed by the fact that American companies are now making money off of the war in Ukraine, and we are not doing anything for the Ukrainians right now. We, the American people, we, the taxpayers. The president loves to talk about burden sharing. I don't know if you've noticed that. I'm all for it. We should share the burdens in NATO. I'm all for that. 5%, 3.5%. I'm all for that. We need to be sharing the burden with respect to Ukraine, and partly because they need our weapons, they need our Tomahawks, they need weapons that only we have, but partly that would send a signal to Putin that we're not going to abandon Ukraine. So I'm not feeling optimistic that's going to happen anytime soon, but I hope eventually we will get involved in helping the Ukrainians. And by the way, the American people are with me on this. The polling is crystal clear that the president is out of step with the American people. Tragically, the administration and Congress have not brought up a new bill to renew our assistance to Ukraine.
Russia, you courageously went into the lion's den to serve as ambassador to Russia. Tell us a little bit of overall your experience there, the good, the bad, the ugly. Just how do you think back on that experience?
As ambassador, right? Not
yes, as ambassadors.
Because I lived there many times, and the most euphoric time I lived there was in 1990-91. when the Soviet Union was about to collapse and hundreds of thousands of people were on the streets, and democracy, and just being American made me a rock star. It was the exact opposite experience going there in 2012 because, again, there were hundreds of thousands of people on the streets in December. There's a parliamentary election. It was falsified, just kind of the normal, I remember meeting in the White House Situation Room, 5-6%. This is just a normal election in Russia. But this time around, Russians, we would call them the middle class, people that own things. They called themselves the creative class. By the way, one of their slogans from that time was, no taxation without representation. I don't know if you've heard that one, because that's what they're saying. You're taking our taxes, but you're falsifying who represents us. So they would invoke that, and then 200,000 people came out on the streets to protest those falsified elections, and they scared Putin. And that's right when I became the U.S. ambassador. Correlation is not causation. We teach that at Stanford. But because of that, I became the poster child of this argument that is still there today, that we, President Obama, Secretary Clinton, and me, that I was sent to Russia to foment revolution against Putin. And I remember I got there, it was a Martin Luther King weekend, so we had a few days. And by the way, I had to convince my family to move there. They weren't so excited, but I was trying to make it exciting. And we moved into our big Spaso house, this beautiful place. And, this is going to be so great to be here. And my kids, you're going to learn Russian. And, January in Moscow, it's not that cold, guys. These are California kids. And it was all kind of fun. And that house is filled with history, right?
It's amazing.
Kissinger's been invoked. You've been there. Ronald Reagan's been there. You see this incredible history. And it was like George Kennan's photos on the wall. He was an ambassador there, lived there. And that Sunday night TV show, it'd be kind of the equivalent of our 60 Minutes. It's called La Naka. And it was a guy, Misha Leontiev, who's used to be a friend of mine. He wrote this, he had this 20-minute hit piece on me saying, and this is true, I once published a book called Russia's Unfinished Revolution, Political Change from Gorbachev to Putin, 2001. Very academic book, by the way. This book's much better. And filled with all kinds of theory and hypotheses and all that. But he said he wrote this book then, and now he's come to complete the revolution. And that became the difficult part of being there. And the truth is, I did know opposition people. These are people I knew from 1991, 92. I did know Alexei Navalny. He actually never met with me when I was ambassador because he didn't want to create the footage of that. His daughter went to school at Stanford, for those of you who don't know, and he was tragically killed by Putin last year. But that was the hard part. And then they did all kinds of nasty things, harassing my, monitoring us to try to get under my skin, right? Following my kids to school, following me when I went to my son's soccer games, going to church behind us. They would come in, sit in the pew behind us. And my bodyguards, of course, would know who they were, but it's their country. We can't pull guns on them or something. My bodyguards didn't have guns. That was not easy. And then the macro bilateral policy was falling apart. We were trying to preserve some stuff on arms control. Our mutual friend and colleague, Rose Gottemiller, was still coming to try to do follow-on things to the New START Treaty. We were trying to figure out a way to end this horrible war in Syria and failing. My last book, which was about this time, the longest chapter is called Chasing Russians, Failing Syrians, because we tried and we failed. That's on the negative side. But the positive thing, a couple of things I want to say, if I have time, if I'm allowed to have time. Okay.
We're about to wind up.
Okay. Maybe this is a good place to end. First of all, your job is not just to talk to Putin and the government. Your job is to engage with civil society and to represent America in all of its dimensions. And both of those things were fantastic. My job was to go to the Bolshoi Theater, right? My job was to be there as the ambassador. But my job was also to bring the first band that ever performed at Spaso House was a country western band from Montana, right? And by the way, there was a culture clash there. I was like, well, where's the dance floor? I came down, where's the dance floor? And the woman who ran the building at the time, she said, Mr. Ambassador, we don't dance at Spaso House. This is a concert. And I was like, I know country western bands, but you heard my dad's from country. If you don't dance for a band from Montana, that is an insult to them. And we compromised, and my wife and I eventually got up and did the two-step, and then everybody danced, and it was raucous, and the Russians can't do the two-step, but it was fun. But that was the honor to represent America in all of its dimensions, right? Governors, business, the NBA came to my house. My kids love the NBA. They haven't been to my house in Palo Alto. That was just an honor of a lifetime. And I look back at that only with fond memories. If you ever have the chance to be a U.S. ambassador abroad, do it. It's a great job.
I am truly sorry to bring this discussion to an end. George Shultz was a good friend, and he actually co-chaired the campaign to build this beautiful building.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, his wife Charlotte was on our board for
fantastic.
30-some years.
Wow.
And he used to tell me, with all of his brilliance and wisdom, he used to tell me that the thing he liked about the Commonwealth Club was we always ended our programs on time.
He was always militant about that. Yes. I see it says 0 right there. We are done.
So please join me in thanking Dr. Michael McFaul.
Thank you all. Thanks for coming.
Author of Autocrats versus Democrats.
Thank you. Thank you.
Please pick up a copy of the book outside. If you'd like to become a member of the club, please visit our website, talk with one of our staff here. They can sign you up on the spot. I'm Gloria Duffy. Thanks to Dr. McFaul, and see you next time.
Thank you all. Thanks for coming.